In today's video, you're going to learn the fetch method within JavaScript. We are first going to give you a conceptual overview of how the fetch method works, and then we're going to dive into some different examples of how to use this method and some kind of different cool things that you can do with this method to kind of customize it for your use case or the problem that you're solving. So the fetch method is a method that provides an easy way to make network requests within JavaScript. It is a global method that you can call to make these requests. One thing that's important to remember about fetch is that it is async and it returns a promise. So when you call fetch, it is an asynchronous method and it is going to return a promise. And this promise is going to resolve with a response object. And this response object, it will have some different properties and some different values in it to kind of tell you whether your request was successful or not. And it also has some helpful methods on this response object that can allow you to kind of work with the data that you receive back from your network request. For example, if you receive JSON data back from your network request, and if you don't know what JSON is, my last video was all about JSON, but it has a .json method that will allow you to parse that JSON and to actually use some of that data that you get back from a network request. Now, a very important thing to remember about fetch that can be really confusing for beginners when you're just starting out, and it can definitely lead to bugs, is that the promise returned from fetch, that promise, it will not reject on an HTTP error status code. The response is going to have some sort of status code. And just in general, a code in the 200s is going to be a successful request. A code in the 300s, I believe, is a redirect. A code in the 400s is some sort of client error. And then a code in the 500s is some sort of server error. And even if you have one of those codes that is an error, it will not reject your promise. It will still resolve your promise and have a successful resolution, but it will just have a status code that exhibits that there was an error. And that promise, it's only going to reject if there was some sort of network failure or if there was something that prevented that request from completing. Okay, so a error status code from your network request, a 400 or 500 request, that is not going to reject your promise returned from fetch. The only thing that's going to reject that promise is if there is some sort of network failure that prevents your request from completing. All right, but let's go into some examples here to make things a little bit more clear on how the fetch method works. So here on line 27, I have a URL, and this is just like an open URL that Mozilla Developer Network provides that I can hit this endpoint and it will return some JSON. So I can make a request to this endpoint and it returns me some data. And I'm going to use the global fetch method to hit this endpoint and to return some data here. So here is where I call fetch. Fetch is a global method, like I said, which means that we can just use this for free within our programs. I do not need to access this method on any object or anything like that. I could just call fetch straight away within my programs. And then the most basic fetch is one in which you just pass the URL you want to make a request to the fetch method. And by default, this is going to make a GET request to this URL. So here I call fetch and I pass in my URL. And the fetch method, it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to make a network request, a GET request to retrieve some data from this URL. Now I'll show you a little bit later on how you can customize this method in which you could make a post request to create some different documents, or you can make delete requests, patch requests to update documents and different things like that. But here, the most basic example is I'm just going to make a GET request to this URL here. And then since fetch returns a promise, I can handle that promise with the .then method that you can chain onto promises. Now, I could also use async await here. That would totally be fine. You could handle promises any way that is your preferred way. Here, just for the sake of ease, we're just going to attach a .then. So when this promise fulfills, I'm going to get my response object, and then I'm going to console log my response. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to then call the response.json, the JSON method on my response object, which is going to parse that data. It's going to return that to my next .then method here, and then I'm just going to console log that data. Okay, so this fetch method, I'm going to first console log the response object, And then I'm going to basically just return my response.json. And then with fetch, you can chain on your .thens because every .then returns a promise itself. So then I'm going to console log that data here. So if I run my program, you're going to see that after a couple of seconds there, I get some data console log to my output here. And if I extend this a little bit, you're going to see the first thing that I console log here is going to be this response object. And this response object, it's going to have a couple different properties that might be useful when you're using the fetch method. So it has a size property. And then maybe more importantly, we'll scroll down here. It also has a status property in which the status is 200, meaning that was a successful network request. And right here, this is where you could kind of check within your .then function. You could check, okay, is my status in the 200s? If yes, run my code like normal. But say you want to know, okay, well, what if I return an error code back? How should I handle that? Well, maybe you check the status code and see, okay, is my status code in the 4 or 500s? If yes, then maybe you throw an error. So then you trigger your .catch method to run. Or you could also check the status text. You can see here, since it was a status of 200 and a successful request here, you get an OK status text. But if it failed, you wouldn't get this status text. And you could check this text to see, okay, was my network request, did it return a successful response? And that's how you could handle errors here. Because like I said, the fetch method, it won't reject your promise that it returns if you get a status code that is technically an error, like a 4 or 500 here. All right, and then you can see there's a little bit more information here within the response object, but I would say these are probably the two most useful ones that you can use, is checking that status code or the status text. But then here, you see the next object I console log here is after I call my .json method. So this is going to parse the data of my network request here. And you can see that this returns whatever the API returns. This is the JSON it returns. It looks like it returns some different superheroes here. Okay, now one thing that's important to remember about the .json method, this method here, it returns a promise. So if you were using like async await here, you would want to use the await keyword to await the promise return from .json, because that method returns a promise. And you could also do what I did here and just chain on a .then to it and handle it that way. All right. But the .json method of a response object, it is async as well, and it returns a promise. Okay, but this is the most basic use case of the fetch method. You just pass in a URL, and then by default, it makes a GET request to this URL. It is going to be an asynchronous request that returns a promise, and then you can handle that promise using await or the .then method that you can chain onto promises. And then if you know that you're getting JSON back, you can use the .json method, which is also asynchronous, to convert that to some more usable data. And just remember that when you use a fetch method, the promise return from fetch will not reject from a 400 or 500 status code. It's only going to reject if there's some sort of network error that prevents the promise from resolving. Now, let's look at some other things you can do with fetch. So for one, you can pass a bunch of different options to the fetch method as a second argument. So let's look at this example here, in which you can see that there's a lot more going on in this example. I have an overall asynchronous function here, and it accepts a URL and a data object. And then what you can see within this overall function is I call fetch. And this time I use async await just to kind of show you how that would work as well. So here I'm going to await the return value of fetch because fetch returns a promise and is asynchronous. And I first pass in my URL here, just like I normally would. So whatever URL I pass to this post data function, I passed it in as a first argument to fetch, but then as a second argument to fetch, you can actually pass an object. And this object can contain some different properties to allow you to customize your fetch method. So here, one of the properties that I can pass to fetch is whatever method I'm using. So I assign the method property. I can assign this to get, post, put, delete, patch, any of the valid request methods. And like I said earlier, this is automatically going to default to the get method. But here I'm saying I want to post a method. I want to create some different documents or create a different resource at this URL. And then you can also set some different properties like I do here, like the mode. I'm setting it as cores, which is the default. And then you can set your cache settings here. And then you can also set some different headers. So content type, application JSON. And then in the body of your object here that I'm going to be posting, one thing that's important to remember is when you have some data that you're sending across in your body and your content type is JSON, then it's important to make sure that you stringify your data before making that post request to send across the network. So here I can use the JSON object that you get for free within JavaScript, and I can call the .stringify method, which is basically going to create a JSON string of the data that I pass into it as an argument. And when your content type is set to JSON, you're going to need to make sure to stringify your data that you're sending in your network request. And then once I return this response here, I'm just going to return my response.json, which is going to return a promise here, and then I can handle that however I would want to handle it. And then when actually calling this method, I would just call it with my target URL, and then I can call it with the data that I want to post to this URL endpoint. So here, when I call this method, it's going to pass this example.com URL as an argument right here, and it's going to pass answer is 42 to this data object here. And the fetch method here, it's going to make a post request to that passed in URL with all these different options and the body of my content that is stringified right here. All right. So this is how you would make a post request with the fetch method. And it's also kind of how you would make a put request, a delete request, and any request that isn't just a straight up GET request. And even if you're using a GET request and you need to set some different settings for your headers or your cache or your cores or anything like that, then that's where you would pass the second object to fetch to customize your request there. Now, taking you over to the Mozilla Developer Network documentation here of the fetch method, I'm going to just show you some different options that you can pass to the fetch method. So these are the options that you can pass as the second argument to fetch. And you can see you can pass the method, the headers, the body, the mode. You can pass some different credentials if you need to. Your cache settings, a redirect setting, your refer. You can see that you have a ton of different options that you can pass to fetch. Also, a signal, which can allow you to cancel network requests, which can be helpful and might be like a helpful JavaScript tip I do in the future. But you can see there's all these different options that you can use here to customize, as I mentioned before. All right. Now, also with the fetch request object, and you don't necessarily need to just pass in the URL and this second argument as an object here. So the way that you could do this here is you could use the request constructor function here, and then you can basically use the same API that you would use when using fetch. So you can call the new request constructor function, and that is going to create a request object for you. And then here within this constructor function, you can see that just like I do with fetch, the first argument I pass is a URL, and then the second argument I pass is an option of all of my headers, my method, my mode, my cache, all those options that you can also pass to fetch. So this is going to have the same API, or you would call this the same way you would call fetch. But this can be potentially just a cleaner way to use the fetch method. And then you could also create this request here and then use it in other areas of your program if you have a similar kind of way of calling your fetch method throughout your program. Then the way that I would call my fetch method is I would just pass in my request object that I make right here on line 61, and then I would handle that just like any other fetch method. Now, there's definitely more that you can do with fetch. Like I could configure these headers here, calling the new headers constructor function, and there's other constructor functions here that you can use when making requests, but this should give you the fundamentals on how the fetch method works. And it should also give you the fundamentals on how you can customize your fetch method. And just know that if you are finding yourself repeating a lot of your logic a lot when creating your different requests and setting up your headers and your different methods, just know that it's very likely that you can use some sort of constructor function like this to create your own headers, in which you can then reuse that throughout your program rather than needing to hard code everything every time you use the fetch method. Hopefully that gives you a good understanding of the fundamentals of how the fetch method works and how you can customize it within your program. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in that next one.